Hello, my name is Ron. I'm an addict. And I'll give you just a little bit of background uh, on myself. I'm a member of NA, been clean for 42 years. So I got clean in the 70s and kind of been in the trenches of NA for this entire time. I served on the world board of NA for 12 years in the early 2000s, and I was an office staff member of in NA in the mid 80s. So and then just tons of local service, and then working continuously with addicts as a sponsor, a sort of mentor for this whole time too. So that's really the experience base I'm drawing on. Normally, when we do these sorts of things, we're presenting material that we have developed, and some of the stuff like you just saw now, and that you'll see later when Craig speaks. But I found this question quite interesting that Shane asked me to do today, which is what's exactly going on in these steps anyway, and what are these steps? And we've got lots of obviously lots of literature on that designed for the addicts to work these steps, but for a presentation in 20 minutes, I don't know of anything that just sort of succinctly answers that question. So I'm coming right out and saying the presentation that I'm going to give you today, this hopefully everybody realizes this is Ron's take, not necessarily that of NA as a whole, but it's also coming from that experience base. So it's not sort of left field either, but it's going to be my best shot at answering that question. What are these steps, and what's going on in these steps? So I'm going to jump right in with that little disclaimer and just say the first point to be made is probably everybody knows, but the steps were originally developed by Alcoholics Anonymous, and we adopted them and then adapted them. And if you look back at the history of that, the steps were written in 1938 when they were, I just saw the little flash saying my internet is unstable. Hopefully that you can still hear me all right though, huh? Okay, so Shane, give me some kind of signal if I start to get unstable. In 1938, in AA, they were writing they were writing the big book, and they put the steps together for the first time then. When we adopted the steps in 1953, and in my view, there's only one serious change to the steps, one significant change to the steps, and Shane already mentioned it, but I want to kind of put a little fine point on it also and say that this is a fairly significant change in the basis of the steps, which is the first step. If you listen to the first step of AA, it says, we admitted we were powerless over alcohol, that our lives had become unmanageable. And if you were going to try to adapt that step then to addiction more generally, which is what we were trying to do, drug addiction more generally, without making a substantive change to it, you would say something like, we admitted we were powerless over drugs, or we admitted we were powerless over, and then name the drug, narcotics, it's something like that. But in our program, our founders decided they were looking for something that was a single point of focus, like AA made much of the fact that alcohol was their single point of focus and their single common identification. And if we start saying we admitted we are powerless over, and then name all these drugs that are very different for different people, then we start the basis becomes our differences, not our similarities. And so when you say I'm powerless over that drug right there, but I'm powerless over this, my addiction, my thinking, my feelings, my behavior patterns, my obsessions, my addiction. This is what I'm powerless over. That's a fairly significant shift in focus. So that's the one. And then there are some other smaller things, but I think that's the biggie. Otherwise, we are using the steps of Alcoholics Anonymous. So when I say, what are they? and how do they work. Let me go back to their origins for a second in the mid 30s. I'll tell you just a quick story. Hopefully I can make it quick. It's not necessarily my strong suit, but I'll try. This guy, there was a guy named Roland H, who was a hopeless addict, and their language would be alcoholic. Our language for the same thing is addict, because we're always looking to make it universal. But Roland was a hopeless addict, and at that time, what happened with hopeless addicts is they ended up in what they called then insane asylums, and that it was basically put them away, because this condition at that level of being chronic is not something that there's recovery from. And so Roland wasn't ready to accept this, and he was a person of means, and he decided to seek the best treatment available in the world for this, because he was going to get better. And so he actually flew to Switzerland and became a patient of Carl Jung. And so this is sort of an interesting and significant fact of the origin of the steps, is that after Carl worked with him a bit, or Dr. Jung, I'm not that familiar, me and Carl on first name basis, but after they worked together for a bit, Jung told him, actually, I can't help you. And in fact, I've never seen an approach, where a psychologist can help someone like you. But I have seen people find a solution. Unfortunately, though, this solution is an awakening of spirit. That the solution to what ails an addict is a spiritual awakening, and even that's hit and miss. But I have seen it actually work sometimes. So the only thing I can tell you is go back home and see if you can find that, in the manner of your choosing. And so he went and he joined something which was then kind of a popular group that was spiritual in nature, spiritual, not religious in nature, which was the Oxford groups, founded by a man named Frank Buckman back. And it was hot in the mid 30s when this was happening. And so he joined this group, and one of the things that they do is help others. And so he tried to help a guy named Ebby Thatcher. This is all very famous stories of the history of AA. And Ebby was again a hopeless addict, hopeless alcoholic of that same, and they were finding that applying these principles of the Oxford groups was getting them some success. And Ebby worked with a guy named Bill Wilson, who famously is the guy who founded AA and the guy who wrote the big book and eventually developed the steps. So the significance of this story is that the premise that Roland came back from meeting with Dr. Jung was that the premise was that what is a solution for addicts is a spiritual awakening. And the Oxford group at that time was working with a book called The Varieties of Religious Experience by William James. And in that book, James goes through all the various religious paths, spiritual paths, that many of them, he breaks them all down. And this was published in 1903, by the way. And he identifies things that are in conflict between the two. If this one holds this tenet and that one holds that tenet and they're in conflict, he canceled them out. And he said, is there anything that you can find when you look across all the various varieties of religious or spiritual experience that is common to all of them? And he came up with only two things. He said that the one thing is that there's something wrong with us as we exist. Every spiritual we are incomplete. We are, some would say sinners, others use other language, but they all say there's something wrong with us in the human condition, and that the solution to this thing that's wrong is to make the proper connections with what James called a higher power. He's the one who coined that. It wasn't the AA that coined that, and that this would, if this would produce an awakening of spirit. This is what they all had in common. So those two kind of influences come together, and Bill, when Bill was trying in his early days to carry this message, as we call it, to work with others, he wasn't having any success with them, but he had a lot of success with himself. He didn't drink again. And so, and at some point, just to kind of cut through all of that now, at some point he wanted to distill all this down from the teachings of the Oxford group, which really, the Oxford group had what they called four absolutes. These are the four absolutes that produce, if you can enact these in your lives, they produce this awakened spirit. And they are absolute honesty, absolute purity, absolute unselfishness, and absolute love. But Bill looked at these and he said, yeah, I'm going to hand these to an addict and they're going to go, oh, okay. And, I don't think so. That the way Bill phrased it, he says there was enough wiggle room there where every one of us would fall through the cracks. So what the steps represent is an attempt to take those four absolutes and to take this sort of like experience that Bill had been gathering, and he, as he said, patch the cracks. Make a step-by-step, a step-by-step kind of paint by numbers approach to this awakening of spirit, and that's what the steps are. Okay, I'm halfway through here, so that's perfect. Okay, so given that what the steps are now, what I've covered so far, as I said, the premise of the steps is that the antidote to what ails an addict is an awakened spirit, and that we can have a systematic way of achieving the awakened spirit. And they attempt to kind of take these four absolutes of the Oxford group, and I could go through and say kind of where they each show up, but I think I'll skip over that just in the interest of time, and say that. But that's what they were trying to do. So I'm going to review the steps in groups. I'm going to talk about the first three steps. If I can find where I made my note, the first three steps address what I'm just using my own language here when I say they kind of address what I think of as the paradox of power. When you first encounter the 12 steps, some professionals look at the 12 steps and they say, I don't know, they're talking, the first step, we admitted we were powerless over our addiction, that our lives have become unmanageable. You're dealing with a population that's already disempowered and they need to be able to find their power, not walk around saying, I don't have any power. So I just want to point out that there's a bit of a paradox there, where in order to find that power and become empowered, which is really what the steps do, I have to first acknowledge that the power that I've been drawing on to this point is completely insufficient to the task. So that would be my own will, my best intentions, my best thinking. These are my ego's power is a power that's insufficient to the task of recovering from addiction. And when you're an addict in the complete throes of this disease, this is not a theoretical proposition. This is just a sad, tragic, really discouraging fact of life. My best intent, I'll take myself. I'm a good guy. I was a good guy then. I was not a bad guy, but my best intentions, no matter the people that I loved, the damage that I was doing, and to other people, my best intentions, my heart was not a sufficient power to combat this compulsion, this obsession that I was living with. And so, the first step admits this lack of power, and the second step acknowledges that this power does exist. It's sort of like James's second premise, right? That the power does exist. I just need to learn how to make the proper connection to it. And so the wording of the second step is, what is it? we sometimes my little mental block at the beginning of the step. We came to believe that a power greater than ourselves could restore us to sanity. And just look at that language for a second. First of all, it's not saying God. It's not saying spiritual power. Just the premise of the second step is that there is a power greater than myself that can do what? Can restore me to sanity. So the steps are offering something about my perspective, my perception, my jump ahead to the 12th step for a second. And it says, having had a spiritual awakening as a result of these steps. So and then ... and I can get back to that, but the sandwiched in there is hope for restoration to sanity in the second step, and having had a spiritual awakening, having awakened the spirit, is what the 12th step says. So again, that's the goal of the steps, is to restore me to sanity by awakening my spirit. And if the steps didn't, in a way, the drugs gave me that. And the drugs gave me a complete change in perception that made the world look a hell of a lot better than it was looking before I took the drug. It made it feel a lot better than it felt. So this experience of me needing something to change the way the world looks and feels, if the steps didn't give me that, I say they wouldn't work. But they hold out the promise of that in the second step, and they say, having had that delivered by the 12th step. So what's in between there is the third step is sort of, we made a decision to turn our will and our lives over to the care of God as we understood him. Now the steps do directly introduce the notion of God. And in the intervening 1938 through, what is that, 2021, there's been a lot of evolution there. For most people, I think it's still true for most people, that sort of quasi-religious language, God, him, isn't necessarily a distraction. For many people, that language is a big distraction, because their perception of whatever the source of love and awakening and spirit is, they wouldn't want to put a label like that on it. And so it is completely acceptable within the culture of NA for people to define this exactly how they define it, whether that's theistic or non-theistic, whether it's this religion or that religion. And the steps actually set the stage for that when they say God as we understood him, with that phrase italicized, meaning in 1938 they were using that language. In our literature, we also used that language, and in our adoption of the steps. But you would notice in the kind of evolution of NA's literature, that language was used pretty directly in the early years. And then about 1990, 1991, we had another kind of flurry of new literature, and the standard language was to use the words higher power, and to kind of create a little more explicit freedom of thought for people to kind of define that their way. But the goal of the steps has never been, and is not now, correct belief about the great mysteries of the universe. In fact, if you think about it, they're saying God as you understand God. In other words, we're going to factor out correct belief as one of the variables of importance. You believe it, this or that, that's fine. Do these things, take these actions. And that's what the steps are. They're experiential in nature. They don't try to prescribe the correct belief or even the correct practice. By the time we get to the 11th step, they're saying, we're talking about introducing prayer and meditation into the mix. And the 11th step doesn't, nowhere in our literature does it define the correct approach to any of that, to meditation. What is meditation? It gives very general, and then we are encouraged to just pursue these things on our own. So again, the key deliverable of the steps is an awakened spirit, a spiritual awakening, not a correct belief or a prescribed belief that the steps come with. So the middle steps, 4 through 9, they're I'm going to refer back to Carl Jung for a second, and I think that one of the things in his approach that you'll find all over the steps is the notion of shadow work. And again, this is me. This is my observation. You'll find this nowhere in NA literature. But just speaking to you as students of this sort of thing, his notion of shadow work is, sort of admitting and revealing things to ourselves about ourselves that we have all these mechanisms for suppressing and not admitting and not facing, and then we got all these ways of presenting that are just ways of dancing around our avoidance of what's kind of true about ourselves. Steps 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9 all go after that in just very systematically and very deeply and directly. So the fourth, we call it the searching and fearless moral inventory in the fourth step, but it's a really hard, deep look, honest look at ourselves, more honest than we've ever looked at ourselves before. And we do that, and then we sit down with, as the fifth step says, God, ourselves, and another human being, and just admit it all. Just admit it all. This is a very huge experiential kind of thing in the life of a member of NA, is that I got through my fourth and fifth step. I got there, and it's sort of a rite of passage, because it's a level of personal honesty that we've probably, none of us have probably ever gone to before. And then 6 and 7. 6 and 7 are a little more elusive, but step 6 says we were entirely ready to have God remove all these defects of character. So notice it doesn't say anywhere that we got that, that we are now perfectly pure. And I think maybe this step kind of goes to the Oxford group's purity absolute, but nowhere does it say that we get there. But what the 6th step says, we stood in a posture of readiness for this, of no matter what the change I have to experience, I am ready for it. We were entirely ready to have God remove, to have a higher power remove all these defects of character that we just unearthed in our 4th and 5th step, and whatever other ones we didn't see yet, And then 8 and 9 is the sort of well known to people, just casual observers of the 12-step world, that we go around and make amends. We make a list of all persons we had harmed and become willing to make amends to them all. And we do this at the direction of a sponsor. We do this in kind of partnership with our sponsor, which is our word for kind of a mentor that I have chosen from among the people, among the NA members that I know, to help me work the steps. And then the last 3 steps, after we go through all of that sort of deep shadow work kind of stuff, then we embark on what I would call the maintenance and deepening steps. 10, we continue to take personal inventory, and when we were wrong, promptly admitted it. So now it's building into our routines of life, this self-examination process that we went to in the fourth step. And the 11th step, we sought through prayer and meditation to improve our conscious contact with God as we understood him, praying only for knowledge of his will for us and the power to carry that out. So again, we adapt any language in there that is a metaphor. I do it like this with sponsees. I say, okay, that phrase, God's will, if you think of it as a metaphor, then what is it that you do believe that this could be a good metaphor for? You know, that's kind of the way I approach it. But this phrase conscious contact also is pretty significant. And so anyway, we introduce prayer and meditation into the routines of life again. And then 12th step, having had a spiritual awakening as a result of these steps, we tried to carry this message to addicts and to practice these principles in all our affairs. So now we're building into our routines of life some service, some giving it away, and some continual application of these principles in our marriages, in our work life, in our relationship with our kids, in all of our affairs. So we, for the rest of our lives, then we're sort of building these routines of applying these principles. So there you go, a little bit of history. What are the premises that led to the 12 steps, and then kind of like the groups of the three sort of groups of steps. One of them being the kind of like getting at what I was calling the paradox of power. I don't have it, but it does exist. I make a commitment to making a connection to it, however I think of and believe of that, and then cleaning it all up, cleaning up the messes that I made in my life, and facing myself just as I am with the guidance of a sponsor. Very, very deep process. And then routines of life that continue to apply these principles kind of on a reel for the rest of my life, on a developing and awakening basis for the rest of my life. So there's the 12 steps. Thanks.